Everyone ignored the weak colt at auction. Mountain Man called his name, and all wept, in the dust of a frontier auction yard. A starving, sway-backed colt stood forgotten. Ranchers laughed. Children pointed. The gavel was ready to fall until a weather-scarred Mountain Man raised his hand and spoke a single name. The dying colt stumbled forward, answering as if it remembered him. The crowd fell silent, tears shining in the eyes of even the hardest hearts. But this act of mercy lit more than pity. It awakened buried secrets, old grief, and a dangerous claim to land. The railroad is willing to burn for as fires blaze, jail doors slam, and hooves thunder across the valley. The Mountain Man must decide, cling to peace and faith, or take up the rifle he swore never to use again. Why did the colt know its name? And will saving one broken creature save an entire town or tear it apart forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The autumn wind rustled through the auction yard, carrying the mingled scents of hay, leather, and dust. Weathered wooden fences penned in horses of every description, while clusters of townsfolk gathered to inspect the stock. Children darted between the adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the steady drone of the auctioneer's calls. "What'll you give for this fine mare?" The auctioneer's voice rang out across the yard. "Strong back, good teeth, 5 years old if she's a day." But at the far end of the yard, away from the prime stock and eager bidders, stood a sight that made even the most hardened ranchers shake their heads. A colt, barely more than skin and bones, swayed on trembling legs. His coat, which might have been bay under better circumstances, hung dull and patchy on his frame. Each rib stood out sharp enough to count, and his eyes held none of the fire that should spark in a young horse's gaze. "Now then," the auctioneer called, his voice noticeably less enthusiastic as he approached the weak colt. We've got this one here. Young stock might clean up nice with proper care." Scattered laughter met his words. A burly rancher spat in the dust. "Ain't worth the bullet to put it down," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "Lost cause," another called out. "No good to anyone." The auctioneer mopped his brow with a red handkerchief, starting bid at 50 cents. He looked around hopefully. 25 cents. Silence fell across the yard. Mothers drew their children closer, turning them away from the pitiful sight. The gavel rose slowly in the auctioneer's hand. "No sale, then. Come on, little Gideon." The soft words cut through the quiet like a knife. Every head turned toward their source, a tall figure standing at the back of the crowd. Tyler McCready's buckskins were worn but clean, his face weathered and marked with old scars. He raised one calloused hand, palm up. What happened next drew gasps from the assembled crowd. The colt's ears, which had hung limp and lifeless, suddenly pricked forward. His dull eyes found Tyler's face, and with faltering steps he began to move. Each placement of his spindly legs seemed uncertain, yet he worked his way toward the Mountain Man as if drawn by an invisible thread. Mrs. Peterson, who'd been leading the church choir for 30 years, dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her shawl. Next to her, old Widow Jenkins did the same, their weathered faces soft with emotion. $1, Tyler said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver coin. The auctioneer looked from Tyler to the colt, then back again. "Sold," he said quickly, as if afraid the offer might vanish. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Tyler approached the colt slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Those closest could hear him murmuring under his breath, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." His rough fingers moved gently over the colt's bony shoulder, and Gideon leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun, followed Tyler as he led the colt from the auction yard. Some spoke of madness, others of waste, but a few mentioned mercy, with something like awe in their voices. The churchwomen continued to dab at their eyes, and even some of the hard-faced ranchers looked thoughtful. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks as Tyler and Gideon made their way out of town. Their shadows stretched long across the dusty road, the tall, straight figure of the Mountain Man, and the wavering shape of the colt beside him. Tyler kept his pace slow and steady, pausing whenever Gideon's strength seemed to flag. "Easy now, little one," he murmured, waiting patiently as the colt caught his breath. We've got time. The good Lord didn't make the mountains in a day. The last rays of sunlight caught them as they started up the ridge toward Tyler's cabin, painting everything in shades of gold and purple. Tyler's hand never left the rope, his touch gentle but sure, guiding the trembling colt step by careful step toward home. Behind them, the town grew quiet as evening approached, but the story of the mountain man and the colt he'd named Gideon was already spreading from porch to porch, carried on voices soft with wonder. The evening shadows lengthened as Tyler led Gideon away from the auction yard. Golden light painted the western mountains, and a cool breeze carried the first hints of night. The colt's legs trembled with each step, his ribs rising and falling with labored breaths. "Steady now," Tyler murmured, shortening his stride to match Gideon's faltering pace. Every few minutes, he stopped to let the colt rest, his calloused hand gentle on the animal's bony shoulder. "No need to rush. The good Lord gives us the time we need." They hadn't gone far when jeering voices broke the evening quiet. A group of boys lounged by the roadside, tossing pebbles that clattered in the dust near Gideon's hooves. The colt flinched, pressing closer to Tyler's side. "Hey, mister," one boy called out. "How much meat you reckons on them bones?" Another boy laughed. "Ain't enough there to feed a coyote." Tyler kept his eyes forward, steadying Gideon with a quiet word. The boys' taunts faded behind them as they continued their slow journey up the mountain road. In the growing dusk, memories washed over Tyler like autumn leaves in a stream. He remembered another evening. 3 winters past when he'd knelt beside Sarah's bed as fever burned through her slight frame, how her hand had felt so light in his, like a bird about to take wing. He'd prayed then, harder than he'd ever prayed before, but the Lord had called her home anyway. After that, the cabin had grown too quiet, the mountains too empty. Many nights he'd asked God why he'd been left behind. What purpose remained for a man alone? Now, watching Gideon's determined steps, Tyler wondered if he was beginning to understand. The Lord's ways weren't always clear at first sight, but sometimes they revealed themselves slowly, like a trail emerging from morning mist. When they reached the creek that crossed the mountain road, Tyler paused. "Here now, little one, let's get you some water." He led Gideon to the bank where the water ran clear and shallow. The colt lowered his head cautiously, lips barely touching the cool surface before taking tentative sips. Stars were beginning to prick the darkening sky by the time they reached Tyler's cabin. The log structure stood solid against the mountain backdrop with a lean-to shed attached to one side. Tyler had built it himself, each log carefully chosen and fitted, though lately he'd let some repairs slide. Now, looking at Gideon's trembling form, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Welcome home," he said softly, leading the colt toward the shed. Inside, he spread fresh hay in the corner furthest from the door where the wind wouldn't reach. From a peg on the wall, he took down an old blanket Sarah had made from wool scraps. The familiar pattern brought a lump to his throat as he draped it carefully over Gideon's back. In the cabin's single room, Tyler stirred up the banked fire and set about preparing his simple supper. The familiar routine of heating beans and warming cornbread brought comfort after the long walk. When the food was ready, he bowed his head. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice filling the quiet cabin, "thank you for this food, and for bringing this little one into my care. Guide my hands to heal him, if that be your will. Amen." After eating, Tyler filled a bucket with fresh water and carried it to the shed. Gideon stood where he'd left him, swaying slightly, but his eyes seemed less dull now. When Tyler approached, the colt's ears twitched forward, and something like trust flickered in his gaze. "That's right," Tyler said, setting the water within. "Easy reach. You're safe here." He checked the blanket, making sure it covered the colt's prominent ribs, then added another handful of hay within easy reach. Easy reach. Back in the cabin, Tyler settled into his chair by the hearth, not bothering to remove his boots. The fire's warmth seeped into his tired muscles as he listened to the night sounds filtering through the log walls. Above the familiar chorus of crickets and distant coyotes, he could hear Gideon's breathing, still uneven, but steady enough to give hope. Tyler's eyes grew heavy as he sat there, but he didn't move to his bed. Something about this night felt like a vigil, like the beginning of something important. Through the window, stars wheeled across the black sky, and in the shed, a rescued colt drew breath after breath, each one a small victory against the darkness. A rooster's sharp crow split the dawn silence, startling Tyler awake in his chair. His neck and back protested as he straightened, stiff from sleeping upright all night. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, and his first thought was of Gideon. Pushing himself up, Tyler hurried to the lean-to shed. His heart sank at what he found. The colt stood trembling, legs splayed wide just to keep standing. The blanket had slipped halfway off during the night, revealing the harsh angles of his frame. "Easy there, little one," Tyler murmured, adjusting the blanket. Gideon's eyes were glazed with exhaustion, but they tracked Tyler's movements. "Let's see about getting some strength in you." Back in the cabin, Tyler stirred up the cooking fire and mixed oats in a pot with water. As it warmed, he added a generous spoonful of molasses from his dwindling supply. The sweet smell filled the small space as he stirred, reminding him of better days when Sarah would bake molasses cookies for the town's children. He carried the warm mash out to Gideon, holding a handful close to the colt's nose. "Come on now," he encouraged softly, "just a little taste." At first, Gideon only sniffed weakly at the offering. Tyler stood patient and still, arm extended, whispering gentle words. Finally, the colt's lips moved, taking a tentative nibble. Tyler's heart leaped as Gideon began eating from his palm with growing interest. "That's it," Tyler said, his voice rough with emotion. "The Lord provides." After the meal, Tyler retrieved a jar of liniment from his supplies. The sharp herbal smell made Gideon's nostrils flare, but he stood quiet as Tyler worked the medicine into his legs, paying special attention to the joints and tendons. All the while, Tyler kept up a steady stream of soft words, mixing scripture with gentle praise. By mid-morning, the sun had warmed the air enough for Tyler to try walking Gideon outside. He led the colt with infinite patience, letting him take tiny steps on wobbling legs. They managed only a few paces from the shed before Gideon needed to rest, but Tyler counted it as progress. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the road. A group of ranchers rode past, their laughter carrying clearly across the yard. "Still wasting time on that worthless nag McCready," one called out. Tyler kept his eyes on Gideon, steadying him as the horses passed. A moment later, lighter footsteps approached. It was Eleanor Price, the town's schoolmarm, walking home from gathering wildflowers for her classroom. She paused at the fence, her face softening at the sight of Tyler supporting the weak colt. "It reminds me of the parable of the lost sheep," she said quietly. "How the shepherd leaves the 99 to save the one." Tyler nodded, touched by her words. "Much obliged, Miss Price." After she continued on her way, Tyler settled Gideon in a sunny spot near the shed. While the colt rested, Tyler climbed up to mend the shed's roof. A few shingles had worked loose during the last storm, and winter wasn't far off. As he worked, he kept glancing down to check on Gideon, who dozed in the warmth of the afternoon sun, when shadows began stretching across the yard. Tyler climbed down and retrieved his Bible from the cabin. The leather binding was worn smooth from years of handling, the pages dog-eared and familiar. He sat on a stump near Gideon and began reading aloud from the Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, his deep voice gentle in the evening air. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Gideon's ears twitched at the sound, and Tyler smiled. Continuing to read verses about God's care for the weak and weary Dot, as darkness settled over the mountain, coyotes began their nightly chorus. In the distant hills, the wild sounds made Gideon start nervously, and he hobbled closer to Tyler, pressing against his leg. Tyler set the Bible aside and stroked the colt's neck. "No need to fear," he soothed. "Nothing's going to harm you here." When the night air grew to cool, Tyler made sure Gideon was settled comfortably in the shed with fresh hay and water. Back in the cabin, he knelt beside his bunk, clasping his rough hands together. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for every small step forward today, for the strength to help this little one, and for showing me that even the weakest can find their way back to life. Amen." The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Tyler led Gideon from the shed, noting with satisfaction how the colt's steps seemed steadier. The morning dew sparkled on the grass of the small meadow beside his cabin. "There you go," Tyler murmured, watching as Gideon's ears perked forward at the sight of the fresh grass. The colt's eyes looked brighter today, more alert to his surroundings, though still terribly thin. His movements showed a hint of returning. Strength. Tyler settled into the rhythmic work of mending the split-rail fence that marked the meadow's edge. The sound of his hammer striking nails echoed across the clearing. Every so often, he'd pause to check on Gideon, who grazed with slow determination. The sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air. Tyler was so focused on his work that he didn't notice the figure approaching until a shadow fell across the fence post. Looking up, he found himself face to face with a woman wrapped in a faded blue shawl, her dark eyes studying him intently. "I have been watching from the trees," she said quietly, gesturing toward the forest edge, "for 3 days now." Tyler straightened slowly, noting her dignified bearing and the silver threads in her black hair. She was Cheyenne, perhaps in her 30s, with grief etched in the lines around her eyes. "Name's Tyler McCready," he offered, waiting. "I am Maya Whitebird." Her gaze drifted to Gideon. "That Colt, my son raised him before the settlers came." Her voice caught slightly. Before they killed him in the night raid, Tyler's hammer hung, forgotten, in his hand. I'm powerful. Sorry to hear that, ma'am." Maya's fingers tightened on her shawl. "You showed kindness where others saw only weakness. I watched you tend him, speak to him, as my son once did." The morning breeze stirred the grass between them. Tyler studied her face, seeing both strength and sorrow there. After a moment, he gestured toward his cabin. "Would you care for some coffee, Mrs. Whitebird?" She considered him carefully before nodding. Tyler built up the cook fire while Maya settled onto a log nearby, her movements graceful despite obvious wariness. The coffee pot soon bubbled, filling the air with its rich aroma. "My son named him Swift Arrow," Maya said, as Tyler handed her a tin cup. He dreamed the colt would run like wind across the valley. She paused, watching steam rise from her coffee. But that dream died with him. Tyler sat on his wooden stump, choosing his words with care. "I've been calling him Gideon. From the good book, a man chosen when he seemed least likely." "You lost someone too," Maya observed. It wasn't a question. Tyler nodded, the familiar ache rising in his chest. "My Sarah fever took her 3 winters past." He looked down at his rough hands. She loved horses. Always said they could see into a person's heart. They sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee as Gideon grazed nearby. The morning sun warmed their shoulders, while chickadees called from the forest edge. "My son had gentle hands," Maya said finally. "He would speak to the horses in our way, telling them stories of the stars, of how first horse came to walk beside." "Man, sounds like a special boy." "He was." Maya's voice held pride beneath the pain. "He believed in healing over hatred, even after." She trailed off, gazing at the distant mountains. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Maya rose gracefully to her feet. She walked to where Gideon grazed, placing her hand briefly on his neck. The colt lifted his head, meeting her eyes with quiet recognition. "I will return," she said, turning back to Tyler. "There are herbs that might help his strength return faster." She adjusted her shawl, preparing to leave. "Thank you, Mr. McCready, for giving him a chance at life again." Tyler watched her disappear into the trees, her blue shawl fading like morning mist. That evening, he sat by lamplight in his cabin, Bible open but unread in his lap. Through the window, he could see Gideon dozing in the shed, his breathing stronger with each passing day. The Lord sure works in mysterious ways, Tyler thought, remembering how Maya's eyes had softened when she touched the colt. Here was this broken creature connecting to broken people through memories of those they'd lost. Perhaps that was God's intention all along, not just saving a starving colt, but building a bridge between hearts scarred by grief. 2 days later, the morning air held a crisp bite as Tyler hitched his wagon for the trip into town. Gideon stood quietly beside the wagon, his coat still dull, but his eyes brighter. The colt's ribs still showed beneath his hide, but his legs trembled less when he walked. "Steady now," Tyler murmured, securing the lead rope. He clicked to his old draft horse, and they set off down the rutted road toward town. Gideon followed. Behind his steps, careful but determined, the streets were busy when they arrived, townspeople hurrying about their morning business. Tyler noticed heads turning as he passed, whispers following in his wake. He guided the wagon toward the feed store, where old Jim Campbell stood sweeping his wooden porch. "Well, I'll be," Jim said, leaning on his broom. That scrawny colt's still breathing. The Lord provides strength to the weary, Tyler replied, tying his team to the hitching post. Other townsfolk gathered, drawn by curiosity. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, stepped closer to peer at Gideon. Why, he does look a mite better. Maybe you weren't such a fool after all, Tyler McCready. The murmurs of agreement were cut short by heavy footfalls on the boardwalk. A tall man, in a dark coat, shouldered through the crowd, his clean-shaven face set in hard lines. Tyler recognized him as Mr. Hardwick, the railroad foreman who'd been pressing folks to sell their land for the new spur line. Hardwick circled Gideon slowly, his eyes fixed on the colt's left flank. Interesting brand you got there, McCready. Mighty interesting indeed. Tyler kept his voice even. Bought him fair at auction 3 days past. That's so. Hardwick's smile didn't reach his eyes. Because I recognize that mark belonged to that Indian boy, the one who lived down in the valley where my company needs to lay track. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Same valley his mother still claims rights to, though she can't prove it. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Tyler felt tension crawl up his spine, but he held his ground. Horse was sold legal at auction. Papers are filed proper. Listen here, Hardwick jabbed a finger toward Tyler's chest. That woman's been causing trouble, refusing to clear out so progress can move forward. Now here you are, with a horse that just might prove her claim. His eyes narrowed. My advice, don't meddle in affairs that don't concern you. Tyler met his gaze steadily. Reckon a man does right by the helpless, Mr. Hardwick, no matter who objects. That's your choice then. Hardwick straightened his coat. But choices have consequences out here. He turned and strode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Tyler loaded his supplies quickly after that, aware of watching eyes. The sun was setting by the time they reached his cabin, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. As he unhitched the wagon, he spotted a familiar figure approaching through the lengthening shadows. Maya emerged from the trees, her blue shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. She carried a bundle of dried herbs, but her expression was troubled when she saw Tyler's face. Something happened in town, she said, following him to the cabin door. Tyler nodded, gesturing her inside. He built up the fire while she settled onto her usual log seat, then stirred the pot of rabbit stew he'd left simmering. The cabin filled with warmth and savory aromas as he told her about Hardwick's threats. Maya accepted the bowl he offered, her hand steady despite the worry in her eyes. The foreman speaks truth about the danger, she said quietly. My people's rights to the valley land rest on proof of our living there before the territory was marked. The brand on Swift Erewhon Gideon it was registered when my son worked. With the Indian agent, it could help support our claim. That why you've been watching? Tyler asked gently. She met his gaze. At first, but then I saw how you spoke to him, tended him with respect. She looked down at her stew. It reminded me of my son's ways. From the shed came Gideon's soft nickering, as if adding his voice to their conversation. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney into the darkening sky. Tyler bowed his head briefly. Way I see it, Lord, put this colt in my path for a reason. If standing with you is part of that path, then so be it. Maya's eyes shone in the firelight. Thank you, she said simply. They finished their meal in companionable silence, while outside the evening stars began to twinkle. The air held a fragile sense of fellowship, like the first delicate threads of dawn breaking through darkness. His shed, Gideon stamped softly. At peace in the growing night, morning sunlight speared through the pine branches, casting dappled shadows across Tyler's yard. The air held the crisp sweetness of early autumn as he led Gideon from the shed. The colt's steps were steadier now, though still cautious. Tyler held a length of worn leather reins in his weathered hands. Easy now, he murmured, running his palm down Gideon's neck. The colt's coat had begun to shine faintly under regular brushing, no longer the dull hide of that first auction day, Dot from her perch on the split-rail fence. Maya watched with quiet intensity. She had arrived at dawn, bearing fresh cornbread wrapped in cloth. Now she observed as Tyler began the gentle work of training. Whoa there, Tyler said softly, pressing his hand against Gideon's chest. The colt stopped, blinking at him with growing trust. That's right, good boy. He repeated the motion several times, praising each correct response. Maya tilted her head, surprise crossing her features. You have much patience, she said. Most men would rush, try to break his spirit fast. Tyler shook his head carefully. Draping the reins over Gideon's neck, the good book says a gentle answer turns away wrath. Reckon that goes for horses too. He demonstrated the basic commands again, leading Gideon in slow circles. The colt followed with increasing confidence, his ears pricked forward with interest. When they paused for a rest, Tyler noticed Maya hiding a smile. "Something amusing?" he asked. "You remind me of the old ones among my people," she said. "They say a horse's spirit is like a stream. Try to dam it up, it fights. Guide it gently, it flows where you need." The sun climbed higher as they worked. By midday, the aroma of warming cornbread and bubbling beans drew them to the cabin's shade. Tyler settled on the porch steps, while Maya sat in her usual spot on an upturned bucket. "Your bread's mighty fine," Tyler said, breaking off a piece. Maya nodded thanks. "My mother's recipe. She fed many during the hard winters, when the government rations failed." She paused, then added, "But we endured, as we always have." Tyler reached for his worn Bible, keeping his place with a faded ribbon. "Reminds me of Matthew's words. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." "Inherit the earth," Maya repeated thoughtfully. "If the railroad men let us keep it." Tyler's response was interrupted by high-pitched voices approaching from the road. A group of town children appeared, led by the miller's daughter, Sarah Beth. They hung back at first, eyeing Gideon with nervous curiosity. "Can we see him closer?" Sarah Beth asked, twisting her apron. Tyler nodded, gesturing them forward. Slow and quiet now, he guided their small hands to Gideon's velvet muzzle. The colt stood perfectly still, seemingly aware of their innocence. "He's not ugly anymore?" Sarah Beth whispered, wonder lighting her face. "He looks proud." The children lingered until their mothers called from down the ridge. They ran back toward town, their excited voices carrying tales of the transformed colt, as evening painted the sky in soft golds and purples. Tyler retrieved his old mouth harp from the cabin. Its tarnished surface caught the last sunlight as he settled by the fire pit. The first notes of Amazing Grace floated out across the yard. Maya sat nearby, her shawl drawn close against the cooling air. She began humming softly, her voice weaving through the hymn's familiar melody. Gideon lay in the grass a few yards away, his breathing deep and peaceful. Tyler felt something shift in his chest as he played a loosening of the tight bands that had gripped his heart since Sarah's passing. The music, the quiet companionship, the sight of Gideon's recovery, it all spoke of something he had almost forgotten: hope. He watched the firelight dance across Maya's face as she hummed, saw the same tentative hope in her eyes. Perhaps they were all being led toward healing man, widow, and cast-off colt alike. The hymn faded into the gathering dusk. Crickets took up their evening song, while the first stars pricked the darkening sky. Tyler tucked the mouth harp away, treasuring the moment's peace. Sunday dawned clear and bright. The late autumn air crisp as fresh split wood. Tyler adjusted Gideon's halter, checking the knots one final time. The colt's coat gleamed in the morning light, a far cry from the dejected creature who'd stumbled from the auction yard weeks ago. Maya appeared on the path, wearing her best dress and a clean shawl. Her dark eyes sparkled with anticipation. "He looks fine," she said, touching Gideon's neck like a chief's horse. Tyler nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Together, they started down the ridge toward town, where church bells already called the faithful to worship. Gideon stepped lively between them, his hooves raising small puffs of dust. As they approached the white-painted church, heads turned. Townsfolk gathered for the after-service picnic stopped mid-conversation, staring at the transformed colt. Sarah Beth, the miller's daughter, broke away from her parents. "Look how beautiful he is now," she called, drawing other children like moths to flame. Circuit Preacher Whitcomb descended the church steps, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Well now, if this isn't the Lord's own handiwork." He placed his hand on Gideon's forehead. "From death's door to dancing with life. Reminds me of Ezekiel's valley of dry bones." The children crowded around, begging to touch the colt. Tyler kept a steady hand on the lead rope, while Maya showed them how to offer their palms flat, letting Gideon sniff them first. "Can someone ride him?" Tommy Jenkins asked, bouncing on his toes. Tyler hesitated, studying Gideon's bright eyes and calm demeanor. "Maybe just a short spell, he said finally, "if your ma agrees." With careful movements, he helped Tommy settle onto Gideon's bare back. The colt stood rock-steady, as if knowing the importance of this moment. Tyler led them in a small circle, while the gathered crowd watched, breath held. When Tommy slid down, beaming, spontaneous applause broke out. Even crusty old ranchers who'd scorned the colt nodded with approval. "The Lord surely works in mysterious ways," Preacher Whitcomb proclaimed. "Using the weakest vessel to teach us strength, using a broken creature to make us whole." The picnic spread across the church lawn, checkered blankets dotted with baskets of fried chicken, cornbread, and apple pies. Maya stood near the front steps, her hands clasped tight. Tyler saw her gather her courage before stepping forward. "If I may," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I'd like to tell you about my son, Joseph." The crowd grew still. "He found this colt last spring, barely born, abandoned by its mother. He named him Morning Star and spent every day teaching him trust." She paused, touching the silver cross at her throat. "Joseph had a gift with horses. He said they were like people, some scared, some angry, but all wanting to be loved." Her eyes grew distant. He was 15 when the raid came, too young to die, but old enough to know right from wrong. The silence deepened. Women wiped tears. Men shifted uncomfortably, remembering past prejudices. Through Tyler's kindness, Maya continued, "My son's work lives on. Morning Star, now Gideon, stands before you, proving love is stronger than fear." Preacher Whitcomb's amen rang out, echoed by others. People pressed forward to shake Maya's hand, to touch Gideon's flanks, to offer words of comfort, long overdue. But in the shadows of the livery stable, Mr. Hardwick watched with narrowed eyes. He muttered to the rough-looking men clustered around him, their faces dark with shared purpose. As the sun began its westward slide, Tyler and Maya led Gideon home. Their steps were light, hearts full of the day's unexpected grace. "Did you see Mrs. Peterson hug me?" Maya asked, wonder in her voice. "The same woman who once crossed the street to avoid my shadow." "The Lord moves in His own time," Tyler replied, "sometimes fast as lightning, sometimes slow as spring thaw." At the cabin, they shared a simple supper of leftover picnic food. Lamplight cast warm shadows as Maya gathered her shawl to leave. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving Joseph's memory back its dignity." Tyler bowed his head, humbled. "Glory belongs to God," he whispered. "We're just His willing hands." The night settled around them, full of cricket, song, and possibility. Yet beneath the warmth of their success, a thin thread of unease wound through. The darkness reminder that not all hearts had been softened by the day's miracles. The midnight stillness shattered as Tyler jerked awake, his nose filling with acrid smoke. Orange light flickered through the cabin's window, casting demon shadows on the wall. His heart hammered as he lunged from his bed, grabbing his boots. "Dear Lord, no," he whispered. Choking on the thickening air-dot flames already crawled up the outer walls like hungry serpents, crackling and spitting sparks into the darkness. Through the smoke, he heard Gideon's terrified whinnies from the shed. Tyler burst through his door, the night air shocking his lungs. The fire cast everything in hellish light, his garden, the fence posts, the pine trees beyond. He sprinted to the shed, where Gideon kicked frantically against his stall. "Easy, boy!" Tyler called, fumbling with the latch. Easy now. The moment the door swung wide, Gideon bolted past him, galloping toward the safety of the pasture. Tyler watched until he was sure the colt had cleared the fence. "Tyler," Maya's voice cut through the roar of flames. She peered through the smoke like a ghost, clutching armfuls of horse blankets. "The roof, we must stop it spreading." They worked desperately, beating at sparks that threatened to catch the nearby trees. The heat pressed against them like a living thing, singeing their clothes and hair. Tyler managed to dash inside once. More, emerging with his mother's Bible and a few essential tools before the timbers groaned ominously. "Get back," he shouted, pulling Maya away just as the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. Burning debris rained down, forcing them further from the inferno that had been his home. They stood helpless, watching flames devour 15 years of memories. Dawn began to pale the eastern sky, turning the smoke into ghostly pillars. Maya's hand found Tyler's arm, steadying him as his world burned. The sound of approaching horses cut through their shocked silence. Through the gray light came Sheriff Briggs and 4 deputies, with Hardwick riding smugly beside them. Tyler's gut clenched at the satisfaction in the railroad man's eyes. "Maya Whitebird," the sheriff announced, his voice flat and official. "You're under arrest for trespassing and inciting unrest against the railroad's legal interests." "What?" Tyler stepped forward, rage building in his chest. "She's done no such thing. This woman's been nothing but peaceful, while someone just burned down my home." Hardwick's smile didn't waver. "Careful, McCready. Wouldn't want to add interference with the law to your troubles." Two deputies dismounted, producing iron shackles that glinted dully in the smoky light. Maya stood straight-backed as they approached, her dignity a rebuke to their rough handling. "This is wrong," Tyler protested, moving to intervene, but Sheriff Briggs's hand dropped to his holster. "Stand down, Tyler," the sheriff warned. "Railroads. Got legal claim here, and evidence says she's been stirring up trouble against their property rights." His eyes slid away, unable to meet Tyler's accusing stare. "Don't make this worse than it is." Tyler watched helplessly as they lifted Maya onto a horse, her hands bound before her. She met his gaze with quiet strength, though tears tracked through the soot on her cheeks. "Trust in the Lord," she said softly as they led her away. "Remember Joseph's faith." The riders disappeared into the growing light, hoofbeats fading until only the pop and hiss of dying flames remained. Tyler stood amid the smoking ruins of his life, temptation whispering through his mind. His old Winchester rifle had survived the fire, propped against a tree where he'd left it yesterday. His fingers itched to grab it, to chase down Hardwick and his corrupt lawmen. A soft nickering broke through his dark thoughts. Gideon approached, cautiously, his coat gray with ash, and pressed his warm muzzle against Tyler's chest. The gentle touch seemed to say, "Not that way, not again." Tyler's hands, which had been curling into fists, relaxed to stroke the colt's neck. Tears finally came as he buried his face in Gideon's mane. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "give me strength to follow your path, not my own." His voice broke. "Show me how to fight this battle with love instead of lead." The sun crested the ridge, painting the ruins of his cabin in harsh light. Tyler's grief ran deep as the mountain's roots, but like the streams that carved these valleys, it would not break him. It would shape him into whatever vessel the Lord needed him to be. Gideon stayed pressed against him. Their shared warmth a reminder that even in the ashes of loss, hope could survive. The morning sun rose harsh and unforgiving over the remains of Tyler's cabin. Wisps of smoke still curled from blackened timbers, and the acrid smell of burned wood hung heavy in the air. Tyler stood among the ruins, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, as he picked through what remained of his life. He lifted a cast-iron skillet, its surface crusted with soot. The handle was cracked, but still solid. A broken chair lay on its side, one leg missing, the wood scorched black. These meager remnants were all that survived of 15 years of honest living. Gideon approached with careful steps, his coat streaked gray with ash. The colt nudged Tyler's arm with his soot-stained nose, letting out a soft whicker. Tyler's hand automatically went to scratch behind the colt's ears, finding comfort in the simple gesture. His other hand strayed to the Winchester rifle he'd retrieved from its place against the pine tree. The metal was cool and familiar in his grip, awakening memories he'd tried hard to forget years of tracking. Hunting, surviving by whatever means necessary. Years before, he'd found his way to God's grace. Anger surged through him like wildfire. He paced the ashes of his home, boots crunching on charred wood. Each step stirred up both debris and dark thoughts of retribution. 5 men had participated. In this burning he could track them easily enough. The old Tyler would have already been on their trail. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this test." The weight of the rifle grew heavier in his hands. Images of Maya in shackles flashed through his mind, along with Hardwick's smug face. His fingers tightened on the gunstock, unable to bear the torment any longer. Tyler fell to his knees in the midst of the destruction. He pressed his forehead into the dirt, feeling the grit against his skin. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking, "show me the path. I gave my word to follow your way, but the devil's whispering mighty loud right now." The sound of hoofbeats made him raise his head, but it was only Gideon, moving restlessly nearby. The colt let out another low whicker sound so gentle it seemed to pierce straight through Tyler's rage. He watched as Gideon pawed at the ground, then looked toward the creek, as if asking to be cleaned. Tyler's breath caught in his throat. Here was God's answer, standing right before him. This colt, once rejected and left to die, now stood as living proof of mercy's power. Violence had never healed anything, only patience, kindness, and faith had brought Gideon back to life. "All right, boy," Tyler said softly, setting the rifle aside. "I hear you. Reckon you're speaking for both of us right now." He led Gideon down to the creek, where clear water tumbled over smooth stones with careful hands. Tyler began washing the soot from the colt's coat. As the gray streaks disappeared, revealing healthy hair beneath, Tyler felt his spirit lifting. Slightly. "Can't fight this battle alone," he murmured, working his fingers through tangled mane. But maybe that's not what the Lord intends. The sun tracked across the sky as Tyler tended to Gideon. By late afternoon, he had made a decision. He retrieved his old saddle from where it had survived in the shed, its leather somewhat scorched, but still serviceable. "Never thought I'd be asking this of you so soon," Tyler told Gideon as he carefully positioned the saddle. "But sometimes the Lord's timeline ain't the same as ours." The colt tensed at the unfamiliar weight, but held steady, trusting Tyler's hands and voice. Tyler checked and double-checked every strap, making sure nothing would pinch or bind. Then, with a prayer on his lips, he put his foot in the stirrup and eased himself up. Gideon trembled, but didn't shy away. Kailua kept his seat light, speaking soft words of encouragement. Together, they stood at the head of the trail leading down to town, the setting sun painting the valley in shades of gold and purple. "If we fall," Lord Tyler whispered, "let it be in truth." He patted Gideon's neck. "What do you say, boy? Ready to help me seek justice the right way?" Gideon's ears flicked forward, and with slow, careful steps, they started down the trail. Tyler sat straight in the saddle, leaving his rifle behind with the ashes of his old life. Whatever came next, he would face it with faith instead of firearms, trusting in a power greater than his own anger. The last rays of sunlight painted long shadows. Across Main Street, as Tyler guided Gideon toward the whitewashed church, his muscles ached from the careful ride down, but something stronger than weariness drove him forward. A few townspeople paused on the boardwalk, watching as he dismounted and tied Gideon to the hitching post. Tyler climbed the church steps and rang the bell, its clear tone echoing through the evening air. He rang it 3 times, then waited, his heart pounding beneath his dusty shirt. At first, only a handful of curious onlookers gathered, keeping their distance. Then more emerged from the general store, the telegraph office, homes along the street. "Good folks," Tyler called out, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "I aim to speak truth tonight, if you'll hear it." Some shifted uneasily, glancing toward the railroad office where Hardwick held court, but the schoolmarm stepped forward, nodding encouragement. Behind her, the baker's wife clutched her shawl and whispered to her neighbor. "Last night, men set fire to my cabin," Tyler began, keeping his voice steady. "They burned everything I owned, save what you see before you. Then they took Maya Whitebird in chains, claiming she caused trouble." He gestured to Gideon, who stood quietly beside the church. "This colt here is proof of God's mercy. You all saw him at auction week, rejected, same as folks reject Maya's people. But look at him now." As if on cue, Gideon lifted his head, his coat gleaming in the fading light. The transformation from that trembling bag of bones was unmistakable. Children who had been hanging back now edged closer. Drawn by the colt's gentle presence, little Sarah Miller, the cooper's daughter, stepped forward. "He let me ride him at the picnic," she announced clearly. "He wasn't scary at all. He made me feel brave." "That's right," her friend Tommy chimed in. "My PA said nothing good would come of that horse, but he was wrong." Other children joined in, sharing their own stories of petting Gideon, feeding him apples, watching him grow stronger. Their parents listened, something shifting in their expressions. Mrs. Peterson, who had wept at the auction, nodded vigorously. "I remember that day," she said. "Thought my heart would break, seeing God's creature so mistreated. But look how the Lord works through willing hands." A heavy silence fell as John Baker, a weathered rancher, cleared his throat. "I reckon I owe you words, McCready," he said gruffly. "I was among those who mocked, called that colt worthless." He removed his hat, twisting it in his hands. "I was wrong about the horse and about other things. More voices rose, hesitant at first, then stronger. The butcher's wife spoke of Maya's kindness when her boy was sick. The blacksmith recalled Maya's son helping in his forge, working honest and true. One by one, they acknowledged the wrong done to her. "The circuit judge rides through in 3 days," Tyler said when the voices quieted. "I'm asking you to stand with us. Tell him what you know of Maya's character, her son's memory, her right to that valley land." "Hardwick won't like it," someone muttered. "No," Tyler agreed, "but we answer to a higher authority than Mr. Hardwick. Justice belongs to the Lord, and he uses willing hearts to work his purpose." The crowd murmured, then began to nod. The schoolmarm stepped forward, offering to draft a petition. Others volunteered to gather signatures, to speak before the judge, to stand witness to Maya's good name. As the gathering dispersed into the deepening dark, Tyler felt hope kindle in his chest. He led Gideon around to the church stable, where Preacher Whitcomb had offered them shelter. The familiar sense of hay and horse leather welcomed them as Tyler settled the colt into a clean stall. Exhausted, Tyler sank down onto a bed of straw. Gideon stretched his neck over the stall partition, resting his head on Tyler's shoulder. The gentle weight anchored him, reminding him of all that had changed since that first day at auction. "We're not alone anymore," Tyler whispered, reaching up to stroke the colt's soft muzzle. The words felt like a prayer of thanksgiving, rising into the quiet night. Around them, the town settled into evening routines, but something had shifted. Where there had been indifference, now stood solidarity. Where fear had ruled, courage took root. The next 2 days rushed past like spring floods. Tyler hardly rested, moving from dawn to dusk between the church stable and the courthouse. Each morning, he exercised Gideon in the streets, letting townsfolk clearly see the branded mark that tied the colt to Maya's valley claim. Children would gather to watch, their excited chatter drawing adults to windows and doorways. Schoolmarm Eleanor Price proved a steadfast ally, organizing her pupils to write down everything they remembered about Maya's kindness and her son's gentle way with horses. She set up a desk in front of the general store, carefully recording testimonies from anyone willing to speak. "Truth flows easier from children's hearts," she told Tyler, showing him pages filled with simple, honest words. Circuit Preacher Whitcomb contributed his own statement, recalling how he had buried Maya's son and witnessed the boy's dedication to the Valley homestead. That land was worked with prayer and honest toil, he declared, his weathered face solemn. The Lord sees such things even when men try to hide them. On the afternoon of the second day, a breakthrough came. Samuel Turner, a young clerk from the land office, slipped Tyler a folded paper during Sunday service. It was Maya's original deed, filed properly years ago, but mysteriously misplaced when the railroad began buying up valley properties. The clerk's hands shook as he handed it over. "Mr. Hardwick told me to burn it," he whispered, "but my conscience wouldn't let me." Tyler carefully tucked the document into his Bible for safekeeping. Through the church windows, he could see Hardwick's men watching, their faces dark with threat. The railroad foreman had been busy, moving through town like a storm cloud, attempting to pressure witnesses into silence. $20 to forget what you saw, Hardwick offered Mrs. Peterson outside the mercantile. But the old woman drew herself up straight. "My memory's not for sale," she declared loudly enough for others to hear, "and neither is my soul." Similar scenes played out across town. Hardwick tried bribing the blacksmith with promises of railroad contracts, threatened to foreclose on the baker's shop, even sent men to intimidate the schoolmarm. But something had changed in the town's spirit. Where once there had been fear of the railroad's power, now stood determination to see justice done. Each evening, Tyler returned to the church stable, bone-weary but hopeful. Gideon welcomed him with soft nickering, pressing his velvet muzzle against Tyler's chest. Together they settled into the fresh straw Preacher Whitcomb provided. Tyler's prayers rising quiet but steady in the lantern light. "Lord, give us strength," he would whisper, one hand resting on Gideon's warm neck. "Show us your path through this valley." The third morning dawned clear and cool. Tyler was already awake when hoofbeats announced the circuit judge's arrival. Judge Harrison dismounted stiffly before the courthouse, his black coat dusty from miles of trail riding. The town stirred to life as word spread. Justice would be served today. Tyler brushed his coat as best he could and combed his hair with his fingers. The patches on his sleeves seemed especially noticeable as he led Gideon to the courthouse and secured him to the hitching post. The Colt stood quietly, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Inside, the courthouse filled quickly. The judge took his seat behind the scarred wooden bench, looking weary but alert. Tyler found a place near the front, his heart tightening as Maya was led in by the sheriff's deputies. 3 days in jail had left her pale, but her spine was straight as a pine tree. When she caught Tyler's encouraging nod, a faint smile touched her lips. Hardwick swaggered in with his lawyer, a slick-looking fellow from Denver. They spread papers across their table, shooting confident looks toward the judge. But Tyler noticed the railroad man's hands weren't quite steady as he adjusted his vest. The room fell silent as Judge Harrison called the session to order. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, making patterns on the wooden floor. Tyler could hear Gideon's occasional stamp outside, like a reminder of all they were fighting for. Maya sat with quiet dignity in her chair, hands folded in her lap. Though her shawl was wrinkled from jail, she wore it like a queen's mantle. Her eyes never left the judge's face as the clerk read out the charges against her. Trespassing, inciting unrest, resisting arrest. The room was so still Tyler could hear the scratch of the court recorder's pen. This was the moment when all their preparation, all their gathered testimonies and evidence would finally be put to the test. He touched the deed in his pocket, reassuring himself it was still there. As the judge prepared to begin testimony, Tyler silently recited the scripture that had guided him through these days. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Outside, Gideon whickered softly, as if adding his own prayer to the moment. The courthouse benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles as Hardwick's lawyer. "Your Honor," Preston began, his Denver-tailored suit a stark contrast to the townspeople's simple clothing. "These claims are built on mere sentiment. The railroad's right to development cannot be impeded by those who have no legal standing. On these lands," he paced before the bench, gesturing dismissively toward Maya. "The defendant and her kind were temporary occupants at best. No proper documentation exists to support their alleged ownership." Tyler felt his jaw tighten at the words "her kind," but he held his peace, remembering his vow. When his turn came, he stood slowly, conscious of his patched coat and trail-worn boots. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "I stand here not just for myself, but for truth that's plain as sunrise." He drew out the rescued deed, handling it carefully. "This document shows Maya's family bought that valley land proper and legal. But there's living proof, too, just outside those doors." The schoolmarm, Eleanor Price, stepped forward next, her testimony clear and passionate. "I've watched that colt grow strong under Mr. McCready's care, bearing the same brand Maya's son used. The children in my school knew that boy, knew his gentle ways with horses." One by one, her students stood to speak. 10-year-old Sarah Miller described how Maya's son had shown her how to feed Gideon sugar cubes. Tommy Jenkins, usually shy, spoke up about watching the colt's first wobbly steps in the valley pasture. Mrs. Peterson testified about the day Maya's son had helped her wagon out of a muddy rut, refusing payment except for a simple thank you. The baker, despite Hardwick's threats to his business, described the boy's weekly visits to trade valley herbs for bread. Throughout it all, Maya sat straight-backed in her chair, hands folded in her lap. When her turn came, she rose with quiet dignity. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "My son, James Whitebird, was born in that valley," she said, meeting the judge's eyes. "He learned to walk on that land, learned to ride there, dreamed his dreams there. When he found Gideon's mother struggling with a difficult birth, he stayed up all night to help." Her voice softened. "He raised that colt from its first breath, named him for the Bible story of the unlikely hero. My son believed in peace between all peoples. That was his dream for the valley." Hardwick's face had grown increasingly red during the testimonies. Now he slammed his fist on the table. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "We're delaying progress over a horse and fairy tales." Judge Harrison's gavel cracked sharply. "Mr. Hardwick, control yourself," or be removed. Tyler stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to bring in one last witness. At the judge's nod, Tyler opened the courthouse doors. Gideon stood quietly in the doorway, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. No trace remaining of the skeletal colt from the auction yard. Tyler led him carefully into the courtroom. The colt's hooves echoed on the wooden floor. As he walked straight to Maya, without hesitation, he lowered his head to her shoulder, just as he had done with her son so many times before. Maya's hands came up to stroke his neck, tears sliding down her cheeks. A profound silence filled the courthouse. Even Hardwick seemed struck speechless by the tableau before them. Judge Harrison studied the scene for a long moment, then began to speak. The law must consider all evidence before it, he said slowly. I have seen the deed, heard the testimonies, and witnessed something here today that speaks louder than any lawyer's arguments. He lifted his gavel. I find the defendant's claim to the Valley land valid and binding. All charges are dismissed. The crack of the gavel was almost lost in the explosion of cheers. Women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men clapped Tyler on the back, and children darted forward to pat Gideon. Hardwick shoved back his chair with a screech of wood on wood. His face was twisted with rage as he stormed toward the doors, his lawyer hurrying behind him. But few noticed his exit. They were too busy surrounding Maya, offering congratulations and apologies for not standing with her sooner. Through it all, Gideon remained by Maya's side, his presence a living symbol of justice restored. The morning. Sunlight streamed stronger now through the courthouse windows, touching everything with gold. The courthouse victory rang through town like a church bell. On the courthouse steps, Tyler offered his arm to Maya, steadying her as she descended. Townsfolk pressed close, their faces bright with celebration and relief. Children scattered flower petals from the schoolhouse garden, and the baker presented Maya with a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from his oven. We should have stood with you sooner, Mrs. Peterson said, patting Maya's hand, but we aim to make it right from here on. The autumn afternoon mellowed into evening as people gathered in the church hall. Lamplight gleamed on tin cups and plates. Loaded with potluck dishes, the scent of coffee and fresh-baked pies filled the air. Someone brought out a fiddle, and hymns rose sweet and strong under the wooden beams. Tyler stood near the back, watching the scene unfold. The schoolmarm led her students in amazing grace, their young voices clear and true. Maya sat among the churchwomen, sharing her mother's recipe for berry bread. Even the sheriff looked shamefaced, offering awkward but genuine words of apology. When the preacher called for Tyler to speak, he stepped forward reluctantly, his hat in his hands. Ain't much for speeches, he said, his voice soft but carrying. But I reckon today showed what's possible when folks choose right over easy. Wasn't my voice that turned this tide, was all of yours, speaking truth together. The gathered people nodded, understanding in their eyes. They had discovered something about themselves today, about the strength of unity over division. As the evening deepened, Tyler and Maya took their leave. Gideon waited patiently outside, his coat silver in the rising moonlight. They mounted up Maya behind Tyler and rode out toward her valley land. The autumn moon painted everything in shades of pearl and shadow. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. The night air carried the crisp scent of pine in approaching winter. They dismounted in a meadow near the creek, where Maya's son had once played. Gideon wandered a few paces away to graze, his movements confident and sure, so different from the trembling colt of the auction yard. Right there, Maya said, pointing to a level spot near a stand of aspens. That's where my son always said he'd build his home one day. Tyler studied the location with a carpenter's eye. Good drainage, protected from the north wind. Fine spot for a cabin. He turned to her, his voice gentle. I can help you build it, if you'd like. Not as any kind of savior, just as a neighbor lending a hand. Maya's eyes shimmered in the moonlight as she clasped his offered hand. I would welcome that greatly, she said softly. They settled by the creek bank, where Tyler built a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows as Gideon cantered a spirited circle around them, tossing his head with playful energy. The creek burbled its endless song, and peace seemed to settle over the valley like a blanket. Tyler gazed into the fire, feeling the weight of the past few weeks, the auction yard, The burned cabin, the trial, all of it leading to this quiet moment. Maybe, he said thoughtfully, the Lord has given us all a second chance. Maya nodded, understanding, in her silence. Above them, stars wheeled in the vast Colorado sky, and the fire crackled its own kind of prayer. The first snowflakes of winter drifted down like tiny feathers from a pearl-gray sky. The newly built cabin stood proud in Maya's valley, its fresh-cut logs and careful craftsmanship a testament to the town's changed heart. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the sweet scent of pine into the crisp air. Gideon grazed in the nearby meadow, his coat glossy and dark against the whitening ground. No trace remained of the trembling colt from the auction yard. He had grown sturdy and strong, his eyes bright with life. Every few moments he lifted his head to watch the cabin, as if keeping guard over his family. Inside, lamplight cast a gentle glow across the wooden floors and walls. Tyler sat in his chair by the hearth, his worn Bible open in his weathered hands. The fire crackled softly as he read from the book of Isaiah, his voice steady and clear. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." Maya worked quietly in her rocking chair, needle flashing as she mended a shirt. Her humming wove through Tyler's words like a gentle stream, the old Cheyenne melody matching the rhythm of his reading. Sometimes she would pause, nodding at a particular verse, their shared understanding deeper than words. The peaceful scene was broken by happy shouts from outside. Children from town had trudged up the snowy path to visit, their boots leaving trails across the fresh white blanket. They gathered by the barn, their cheeks red with cold and excitement. Tyler marked his place in the Bible and rose, pulling on his coat. "Reckon they've come to see their friend," he said with a smile. The children bounced on their toes as Tyler approached. "Can we pet him, Mr. Macready, please?" Tyler whistled softly, and Gideon trotted over from his grazing. The horse moved with grace now, powerful muscles rippling under his winter coat. But when he reached the children, he lowered his head with extraordinary gentleness, allowing their small hands to stroke his forehead. "He remembers us," little Sarah exclaimed, and Tyler nodded, watching the scene with quiet joy. As twilight began to settle over the valley, the children reluctantly headed home, their voices carrying back through the gathering dusk. Tyler walked alone to the barn, his boots crunching in the deepening snow. The familiar sense of hay and leather wrapped around him as he stepped inside. Gideon stood in his stall, steam rising from his flanks in the cold air. Tyler approached slowly, running his hand along the horse's strong neck. "Come on, little Gideon," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The colt nickered softly and pressed his muzzle against Tyler's chest, warm and vital. Tears stung Tyler's eyes as the full weight of their journey washed over him. This rejected animal, once destined for a lonely death, had become so much more than just a horse. Through Gideon, God had worked healing in Tyler's grieving heart, restored hope to a widow's life, and softened an entire town's prejudice. "Lord," Tyler prayed softly, his face pressed against Gideon's neck, "you truly do call each of us by name, just like you called this little colt. Thank you for your mercy." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. But inside the barn, inside the cabin, inside their hearts, warmth glowed like a beacon. Faith had built this place. Mercy had restored these lives, and love had forged these bonds. Each snowflake seemed to whisper of new beginnings, of grace falling gentle and sure over all. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.